I read the papers and I thought, or at least the abstracts, to be honest, and I thought it was more of a safety and security panel. So, but that already happened. This one has the strange title of various STM community inputs and caveats. I'm not quite sure what that really means, but I think it's going to be our job to kind of tease out the essences of what the panel has to say. We have one in person, and we have. I think somebody couldn't make it, so we're 3 online. So what we'll do is my colleague Gleason from Aerospace Corporation, he will give his talk. Then we'll hear remarks from the people that are online, and then we'll open up questions and discussions until we pass out from lack of lunch. So I think the floor is yours.
All right, can y'all hear this? Yeah, I hear my voice coming back at me, so I guess it's good. So this has been a great 2 days, right? The panels, like almost every panel, or I think I might as well just say every panel, actually had something to do with the paper that I'm going to go over here. And so hopefully this paper and my presentation now for the next 10 minutes or so help kind of synthesize a bunch of thoughts and ideas that have been coming out in various areas and help kind of pull them together in one kind of organizational structure or framework, so to speak. But I'm going to cheat. I'm going to break the norm, so to speak. Oh, by the way, I probably should have been on the last panel because mine is about verifying norms of behavior for outer space. So, but somehow I got this privilege to be on this panel. But I'm going to break the norm and actually read my remarks because it's a pretty complex chain of reasoning with many layers that I need to get through, and I want you all to be able to follow it. And I don't want to miss any links in the chain, or it will fall apart, and everybody will be like, "What are you talking about?" Because it's once again very familiar to what we've been talking about, but it puts a little new twist on it, I think. I feel like I'm shouting. Am I shouting? No. Okay. So, not used to being amplified. All right, so it's the kombucha. So international space situational awareness, data sharing is growing in importance for space safety. We've heard about that. Space sustainability and space security, right? We all agree with that. But I think less recognized is that international SSA data sharing enables the emergence and global acceptance of voluntary norms of responsible behavior in space. As we just heard Kazuto Suzuki say on the last panel, right? The norm life cycle is going to be a little bit about what I get into. So anyway, so two key premises drive this conclusion that SSA data sharing is critically necessary, I think, for the emergence of global norms. So first, abiding by norms of behavior imposes costs and constraints on freedom of action, which states may not be willing to do unless they are reasonably assured that other states exercise the same level of restraint, right? I mean, why would states or anybody, even at a personal level, accept costs and give up freedom of action if the state was not assured other states are doing the same thing, right? They'd be cheating and they'd be taking advantage of your good offices or your good graces, right? So this leads to the idea that a state's ability to verify the reciprocal restraint of others in space requires that state has access to trusted, timely SSA information. We just heard in the last panel the word trust come up quite a few times, right? And here's the key point based on this first premise. If countries outside the circle of the United States and like-minded countries cannot access trusted information on what is happening in space, they are unlikely to rebuke or even recognize bad behavior in space. We were just talking about shaming, I think, right? Blaming and shaming or praising people who are following. So that's very important, right? But if you can't see what other countries are doing, you're not gonna have the guts to go lay it on the line and say, hey, we don't like what you're doing based on information you can't trust, right? So consequently, emergent norms may not create enough of a collective expectation internationally for proper behavior in space. That is, the norms may never drive significant reputational or material costs internationally for irresponsible behavior in space, and in turn fail to incentivize bad actors to alter their behavior toward conformity with voluntary norms of behavior, right? If you're not getting called out, why would you follow a norm, right? Other than because you're a good person, right? Or a good country. But in turn, space safety, sustainability, and security will not benefit as much from voluntary space norms as anticipated among space norm advocates. The second premise is that a third of the countries in the world will need to accept a norm before it takes root and becomes widely accepted. This gets into the norm life cycle, as Kazuto mentioned a few minutes ago. But a third of the countries in the world. This may be surprising to many people, but this is what academic studies on norm emergence and acceptance has found. And that finding has stood for almost 25 years now. Okay, a lot of people are surprised, a third of the countries in the world, but nobody has been able to academically argue against that point, okay? So let me explain the norm life cycle. The first stage of the norm life cycle is norm emergence, in which norm entrepreneurs try to persuade the critical mass of states to embrace the need for norms. This is the stage we're in now, right? And we've been in for the last 10, 15, 20 years. Norm emergence is followed by the norm cascade stage, which is reached when a critical mass of states have been convinced by norm entrepreneurs to support an emerging norm. We've already heard this today, sorry to be redundant. Got to keep those links in the chain together, okay? Eventually, growing support for the norm leads to a tipping point. Once the tipping point is crossed, other states begin to quickly follow with their support because the norm now has come to define proper behavior among actors. In the norm cascade stage, additional states begin supporting or adhering to a norm without significant effort by norm entrepreneurs because it is simply perceived as the right thing to do. Finally, a norm cascade sets the stage for the third phase, internalization, in which so many actors collectively accept the norm as indicative of proper behavior that the norm takes and take it for granted quality, making norm conformance effectively subconscious. Bad actors may still violate the norm. This is the real world, right? But they will stand out for deviating from what is considered acceptable behavior and will generate ridicule and censure by other actors that shame, which may cause them to conform in the future. In contrast, responsible actors may be critics. This is what it means for a norm to exist. If you violate a norm and nobody says anything, it's not a norm, okay? Or if you're following a norm, because you're a good person, but nobody ever praises you, it's also not really a norm. So there has to be some calling out of bad behavior for a norm to exist. Otherwise, it's just words on a paper, no matter how technically fine-tuned it is or how politically or diplomatically it's been evolved. There has to be some kind, it has to generate some kind of a reaction for a norm to even exist. Okay, so the key to all of this, I'm finally getting to a key, right, is attaining critical mass. How do you get to critical mass? There are two paths. First, focus on key states. Arguably, if the US, China, Russia, France, Japan, and India, for example, agree on a norm, that would probably provide critical mass in and of itself, and the norm would be accepted by the majority of the countries. But that seems unlikely. Even if the US and like-minded nations agree on a norm, that does not mean it is sufficient to create a new collective global expectation of proper behavior in space. The second path to achieving critical mass is to generate widespread support for proposed space norms among as many countries as possible. Broad consensus among some critical states, like the US, the UK, Japan, and so forth, and a range of other relevant states will define the collective sense of how a state ought to behave. This would mean reaching beyond existing US partners, allies, and like-minded nations to a more diverse group of space stakeholders. Only then will those states who adhere to the norm be applauded, and those who deviate from the norm be censured by enough states to matter, right? So the academic literature shows that in the absence of consensus among key states, critical mass can be achieved when at least 1/3 of the countries in the world accept the norm, leading to a cascade. That is, we need to find 60 countries to commit to a norm before it goes viral, so to speak. Well, where can we find them? My friends in the Department of Defense with SSA data sharing agreements, they got 28 international SSA data sharing agreements. That's good, right? That's halfway there, 28 out of 60 countries in the world, that matters, right? But it's not enough, almost halfway there. I'm not sure, but for the sake of argument, let's say those 28 states who have SSA sharing agreements with the US Space Command have a sufficient level of trust in the SSA data that they have access to verify reciprocal restraint by other actors, and will be willing to abide by a norm, giving up some of their freedom of action in space, right? Because that's the trade. For norms, the trade is freedom of action. You're giving up freedom of action when you are abiding by it. But we need another 30 or more states, and they likely need a trusted source of SSA data before they will accept the norm and hopefully spark a norm cascade. So where do we find 30 more? Any ideas? I might as well throw it open a little bit. I'm getting tired of talking. Any ideas where can we get 30 more?
I think we might have an idea.
Dave, I footnoted your paper in my paper, so look for that footnote. So I've heard people argue that it's just the countries that can access space that matter. I disagree. Other people say it's just the major space actors, Japan, France, China, Russia, the US. I'm sorry if there's any I missed right now, because I know I'm running out of time. But where do we get 30 more? I think, there are 100 members of COPE US right? Well, that's a pretty good, that we should be able to find 30 more countries in there. Danielle today talked about Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. Well, there's a whole bunch of countries who have an interest and a stake in norms of behavior in outer space, even though they're not major space powers. So there has to be a way to provide them some trusted SSA information, or they're not going to necessarily feel confident enough to sign up for norms of behavior for outer space. Sorry. Better take a deep breath. I'm trying to go fast. The other thing is so there's I think 80 countries that have satellites in space right now. So there is enough countries out there, even without Russia or China or Belarus or Syria or Venezuela. So this is why I think it's mandatory or almost a prerequisite if we're going to make progress with international norms of behavior for outer space. We need an international framework for SSA data sharing for monitoring adherence with space norms to have a reasonable expectation that critical mass can be achieved, okay? So the two key premises: states won't accept norms and give up freedom of action unless they have a way to confirm the reciprocal restraints of other actors, and at least 60 states need to accept a norm for there to be hope it will become globally adopted. Therefore, an international framework for SSA data sharing for monitoring adherence with space norms is a must. It's not a nice to have, it's a must. If we want space safety, sustainability, and security norms to matter. I'm pounding my paper. I think the US government, perhaps leading from behind, so to speak, should help set this up. So, somehow help create this international SSA data sharing framework. If the US government is serious, by the way, I'm speaking for myself, not the Aerospace Corporation, but anyway, if the US government is serious about really wanting norms to go global and go viral, so to speak, around the world, the US government should help get that going, or else someone else might. And then the US government will have missed its chance to help shape that, whatever it may be. All right, so that's the gist of the paper, but rather than just identifying the problem, the paper goes on, that was only about half the paper, but the paper goes on to outline the strengths and weaknesses of several different types of verification regime types used in arms control. There are ways from the arms control community of verifying compliance with what's in a treaty or what's been agreed upon. And then applying those to monitor compliance with the voluntary space norms. Like, these are voluntary space norms we're talking about, right? For the most part. And so there has to be some special adjustments for that. And it goes on to suggest a few organizational models to stimulate thinking on what an international framework could look like. And that's where I use Dave Finkelman's footnote. He had some good ideas on that. All right, Mark, I'm gonna take a break. Take a break and get a breath. Thanks.
You swap with the next. Thank you, Nick. Mick. So I'm apologizing in advance, the panelists, I don't have your introductory information. So I would ask you after calling you to unmute and give us a little bit of your background and give us your remarks. We'll start with Pourvi.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Pourvi. I am in India right now. I thank you all for the opportunity and this wonderful conference that you put together.
Now your turn to give your remarks about your paper and tell us in maybe 4 or 5 minutes sort of the gist of what you had presented in your reported remarks. Thank you.
Sure. Let me share my screen. All right. The topic for my presentation today is Reigning ASAT, a normative approach from safety to security. Let's just take a step back and see as to how do states get away. They conduct ASATs and then they are not held liable. Why so? So if I identify this problem, I would go back and trace that if we look at Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty minutely, it has been created in such an atmosphere and it has been created in such a way that it elucidates the prospective legal obligations that arise out of, and it fails to contemplate as to how a problem can be captured around legally around ASAT. It absolutely has forgotten to forbid the use of ASAT, and it has lots of legal gaps that I would be pointing out in my presentation today. Starting with the mandate to avoid harmful contamination. Now, this is one vague term that Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty uses, wherein it says that I forbid any such practice which would be, causing harmful contamination. But then legally, so as to speak, there is no explanation around what does harmful contamination amount to, or how would you say that a harmful contamination around the environment is being created? Is it around the space environment? Is it in the LEO? Is it in the GEO? Or which part of the space, now that we know that there is a vast expanse of space out there? Or is it the fellow space objects lying there that they're talking about? The second mandate that it obligates is that it says you should avoid adverse changes. Now, when it says adverse changes, again, it's a legal anomaly here as to what kind of changes are being brought forward. When you say avoid such kind of adverse change, the adversarial impact is around the environment, or whether it is around any celestial body, or whether it is around the entire space environment, the temperature, the heat. What kind of a change are you talking about? This is another anomaly. The third is when you say that you have a mandate under Article 9, before you conduct any experiment, you need to have a prior international consultation. So conducting an experimental activity where you mandate prior international consultation, and where you say at the same time a stipulation that if you have a reason to believe that it would cause harmful contamination. Now, international consultations are, they are part of the United Nations every now and then, but at the same time, when any nation carries out ASAT, be it any nation, India, China, Russia, US, any nation for that matter of fact, why would they consult other nations or tell them in advance as to this is what we are going to do? It is only a flash news once the test is conducted. Secondly, when these kind of experiments are being conducted, again, the treaty is silent on what do you mean by the word activity. In which plane is this activity taken? Now, as we all know, and you all are well versed in science much more than me, I come from academia and that to law. In the event of ASAT, you are hitting a satellite from the ground. So there is absolutely no mention within the treaty which can capture your activity from the ground or in space or from ocean. From where are you going to hit this, take this kinetic kill upon the satellite which is in space? And then you also add a stipulation in the treaty wherein you say you have a reason to believe. Now, this is a vague term, again, legally, so as to say, is it a hunch? Is it a gut feeling that you have a reason to believe that whatever activity you're going to carry out will adversely impact people in outer space, I mean, the satellites in the outer space? So the question falls down to the point that we all know that there are loopholes in Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, along with Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, which mandates that you need to carry out activities for peaceful purpose, but then it fails to define as to what do you amount to peaceful purpose, whether it is non-aggressive in nature, whether it is military in nature, or whether it is any kind of activity which will not trigger a war in future. So this is a picture that I brought forth. ASAT, we all know, has brought forth a lot of debris, and it's one of the most contemporary issue, at least for environmentalists in space, for lawyers in space, as well as for people who are trying to deduce ways to get rid of this kind of a debris. The way forward would be that if you are trying to achieve triple S, security, safety, sustainability of outer space, you need to get rid of such kind of behaviors or such kind of activities which are kind of, there is a loophole that they take advantage of and get rid of. So the way forward clearly is you need to have a binding agreement around debris. All of the panelists before me as well have spoken about it. I would just like to add that once you have this binding agreement on debris and nations do abide by, or there is a way wherein we look forward to this future where we have a binding agreement, there also needs to be an ECAO for space, as we have in laws of aviation, given by the Chicago conference. There needs to be a nodal agency under the UN corpus that would be monitoring, governing, regulating this debris as on daily basis, and then create space situational awareness, then create a traffic management wherein it is easy for nations to transfer knowledge or create that kind of an environment where there is transparency. So having a nodal agency is vital and imperative. Second, comprehensive ASAT ban treaty, just like we have CTBT for nuclear weapons. We also need to have another treaty that makes sure that ASAT can be banned. And when they make this treaty, they also need to incorporate in it and keep a widened group as to whether the kill was taken or that satellite was bombarded right from ground or from space or from high sea or from...
Thank you. We need to move on to our other speakers. So thank you for your remarks. Next up, Shouvik. Please keep your remarks to maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, am I visible to everyone? But I think I can still see Dr. Kantroo's screen. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. Since I only have 5 minutes, I will just try to keep it limited to just brief opening statements about my paper, which has been authored by myself and my co-author, Ms. Anushna Mishra. The paper is called "A Small Step in Outer Space and Cyberspace, India's Preparations for Securing a New Frontier." And in this paper, we have tried to highlight the factor that the interplay between outer space and cyberspace today provides some sort of symbiotic relationship that often holds this potential to be used by one nation to gain some form of competitive advantage over others. And it's quite natural that with all the space-based assets that we have and growth in outer space activities by public and private sector players, as that such assets will turn into potential targets of the threat of cyber warfare. And today, the fallout of any counter space operation would cut across sectors not only related to security, but also a lot of socioeconomic implications. And while all of these anti-satellite actions and counter space technology can take place in multiple modes like kinetic physical, non-kinetic physical, electronic, and cyber modes, Our paper focuses on the cyber mode of warfare that uses both network and software-based modalities to interfere with, compromise the integrity of, and gain control over computer systems driving operations of satellites and other space-based assets. Now, the reason why the cyber mode of warfare can be even more popular, so to speak, compared to the other forms of warfare is there are multiple reasons actually. Easier availability, low entry barrier, less expensive nature, susceptibility to use by even a small group of well-trained individuals, and of course the plausible deniability and difficulty in getting traced back to origin. So these are some of the advantages of the cyber warfare against outer space-based assets. And with space programs focusing on greater onboard data processing, digital components, and cloud computing and packet-based protocols, the scope for such cyber warfare seems to be widening with every passing day, especially considering that most of our space assets comprise the space segment as the uplink, the ground segment as the downlink, and the user segment as the crosslink, all of which transmit telemetry data via computers. Now, insofar as the legal framework on an international level is concerned, our paper refers to how Rule 4 of the Talent Manual 2.0 extends the principle of sovereignty discussed in the UN Charter to prohibit cyber operations directed by one state against another. And then it goes on to discuss different provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, like Article 8, for example, which allows states to exercise sovereignty over space objects registered within their territories. Like we also mention Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty, which allows application of provisions of the UN Charter like Articles 2.4, Article 51 to the domain of outer space. And then we discuss how there are other initiatives like, say, for example, the Schmidt analysis, which considers several factors in order to determine whether a cyber attack may be counted as use of prohibited force in this regard. Now, when it comes to India, of course, unlike, one has to remember that unlike the space superpowers like USA, Russia, and even China, Indian space programs were not a subset of military initiatives. They were largely civilian in origin. And therefore, cyber attacks against communications and command and control systems of space assets, especially when it is coupled with more conventional attacks, can leave India particularly vulnerable, considering its ever-increasing reliance on such assets. And not only can such attacks stem from neighbors with which the country has strained geopolitical relationships, like, say, Pakistan or China, but also individuals or groups seeking financial gain or publicity, as well as terrorist groups with subversive motives. As the paper goes ahead to discuss India's security protocols and position and legislations, and such as the Information Technology Act, the IT Amendment Act, the National Cybersecurity Policy, the National Cybersecurity Strategy, and the roles played by bodies like the Indian Computer Emergency Response Team. We try to figure out how exactly that works and how prepared India is in the context of handling cyber attacks against its space assets. Now, the final thing that we have found out is that there are critical issues which remains to be adequately addressed in relation to India's capacity to address coordinated, resourceful, and targeted cyber attacks, like the command and control hierarchy, the roles which are played by different multimodal organizations and cybersecurity coordinators, and the need for a central agency prescribing standards and protocols in the cyber domain in outer space. And recent studies have actually found India to be ranked in with countries like Indonesia, Iran, or Vietnam in its capacity to fight against cyber warfare, despite the fact that the country has more space assets than any of those other countries. And even the offensive cyber capability of India has been argued to be overly skewed against countries like Pakistan, while its ability to withstand similar attacks from other neighboring states like China or from domestic threats from terrorist groups do not seem to be adequate. So since I'm out of time, I will just conclude by saying that the key element of any kind of policy that India is considering now needs to be focused not only on one neighboring nation, but also cater to ensuring that the relevant space assets are safe from any form of cyber warfare in general. And it's only by undertaking these initiatives that India can hope to leverage its current and future presence in global commons like outer space and cyberspace, and develop the safe, secure, and resilient cyber domain and space assets that can contribute to its claim of eventually turning into a space-reliant nation. Thank you. That will be all.
Marius, your turn. And please introduce yourself briefly. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Thanks, Mark, and hello, everyone. A big thank you also to the organizer for putting this conference together and for including us in this interesting panel. I'm Marius Stanciu-Manolescu. I'm coordinating STM initiatives in GMV, and I am also the project coordinator for the USTM European Union CSA. I've actually been shadowing a bit the panels and session both yesterday and today. And I have to say that as a strong supporter of STM and space sustainability, the discussion topics and the generated engagement were kind of music to my ears. And I'm saying that both on behalf of GMV, that is of course strongly committed to this subject, and also on behalf of the USTM European STM related effort that we are of course coordinating. I'm not sure if any additional motivation is still needed, but of course we all keep on witnessing more and more unfortunate events in orbit, both provoked and unprovoked, and it is obvious and critical that we need to act to, on one hand, reverse that trend, and on the other hand, adapt and organize ourselves to safely, securely, fairly, and especially sustainably operate in this new reality, and maybe more important, in the future reality. So we do face a global threat, and we all need to join forces around the world and come up with a proper STM design fit for this tremendous complexity of future space operations. And here Europe showed a lot of initiative and made it clear that it's committed to take a main part in this endeavor. They have, of course, a significant number of ongoing STM-related initiatives. Of course, we know that the US is also openly committed to this. But in order for STM to become a reality in due time, we really need to start completing these first steps in the right direction and now. Now, getting to the point, the paper we submitted to this conference covers insights from the USTM project on fostering and fortifying the European STM capability. So what are we doing here in Europe under this USTM initiative? USTM stands for Space Traffic Management for 21st Century Space Operations. It is a consolidation and support activity funded under the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program. And it is aimed at analyzing the current STM support competencies in Europe, and also defining the related needs for a future autonomous European STM capability. It is an end-to-end activity covering technology, governance, legal, policy, strategy also, and we'll also have as outcome the recommendation of STM-related guidelines and best practices. We are counting on a quite large team of 19 European entities led by GMV, including relevant research institutes and European industry, worldwide experts and institutional stakeholders that bring to the table an in-depth expertise in all aspects related to space traffic management, including here both, let's say, the established and the new space perspective. Unfortunately, I guess we don't have enough time to mention here every one of them, and you can get to know them in our submitting presentation. But just to help you get a better picture of exactly how well encompassing our team is, we have experts in policy and strategy, also in governance and security, in space law, of course in SSA, SST technology, from the full array of sensors to data processing, onboard positioning, collision avoidance, or re-entry prediction. We are also benefiting from the balanced perspective of both, as mentioned, the conventional and the new space users, from satellite operators and manufacturers to launchers to new space users, covering various topics such as in-orbit servicing, ADR, or even hubs. We also count on the support of a well-known technical advisory board members, both from the EU and also from the US. We have there, for example, Dr. Brian Whedon and Dr. Peter Martinez from the Secure Foundation. We have also one of our hosts from this conference, Dr. Mori Bajaj. First-hand experts from the European Space Agency, from EUMETSAT, as well as from the main agencies that form the USST consortium. Additionally, more than 300 relevant worldwide stakeholders have been identified and are already engaged for dedicated consultations. We are now in full traction, already in the second part of this project, having already celebrated the first two workshops and consolidating first results on the current key strategic, scientific, and technological capabilities. Also on the user needs applicable to STM, and we are now zeroing in on the undergoing analysis covering organizational aspects, responsibility, guidelines, governance, legal, regulatory framework, as well as the policy and security dimension of such a future STM capability in Europe. Finally, we aim at defining the additional scientific and
Well, let's move
sorry,
on.
I was just finishing.
We need to move on. Thank you, though. So
Okay.
to talk about more in this Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you.
Finally, last but not least, Nick, please introduce yourself and give us a few remarks. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, all. Nick Tsamis from the MITRE Corporation. I specialize now in cybersecurity, specifically in the context of operational domains, space being a core focus of that. So we talk about critical infrastructure in today's age. It's pretty obvious to all of us at this conference that space is, we are increasingly reliant on the infrastructure that we're building there. I'm here to advocate on behalf of cybersecurity as a means of reducing ambiguity in the domain via information sharing. Often when we talk about information sharing and SSA, STM, the guise is often disjointed from cybersecurity. And that is directly the notion that we wanted to tackle. The paper we published with my co-authors is titled Determining Operationally Relevant Space Cyber Information. That's an important note. What we're trying to tackle head on is this disjointed nature between sharing cyber information that doesn't have context in the terms of space mission operations in order to perpetuate increased safety and sustainability within the space domain. The core notion that we try to tackle is how do we describe cybersecurity operations in the context of space? And how we propose doing that is a little bit of a different approach than you'll see in other cybersecurity conferences. Typically, what you'll hear is cybersecurity can't be an afterthought. Cybersecurity must be baked in. But it often leads the mechanics of how we do that up to the reader and up to the individual organizations. Our proposal is translating the information that we share and the information that we analyze in the context of native space operations. And how we propose doing that is changing the elements of data that we share so they need not be sensitive, they need not be massive reports, pages deep, that we now require space operations to be cyber aware or cybersecurity analysts to be space mission experts. And that's an important enabler for our workforce development, but ultimately for creating operationally relevant information in the domain. By performing this translation, what we're really trying to do enables a few things. One, it allows us to align to our current norms. Taking a cybersecurity first focused mindset here is not going to prove fruitful. We've seen that fail in other domains, other critical infrastructure sectors, other operational areas. What we need to do is speak space first and bring a cybersecurity approach into the picture. That allows, right, coming out of the prior panel session, an important concept. How do we define a level of parity that organizations that consume information, specifically regarding STM, how do we achieve that level of parity that your consumption is commensurate with the information that you're providing back to the community? Second, it allows us to align to common goals within the space domain. Mr. George from the prior panel session hit this directly on the head, right? If cybersecurity goals are disjointed from goals in the international community as a whole for the space domain, we are never going to appropriately allocate resources. By describing cybersecurity in the context of space operations, we can better align those goals. And lastly, we put a call to action to start executing some of this, leading by example. We propose 4 core tenets about which we reason about operational relevance. And what we suggest is talking about and analyzing the current state of the art on how we're sharing cybersecurity information in the space domain, and critically analyzing that to see where are deficiencies and how can we get better. We use concrete use cases from prior space ISAC exercises that have provided extremely valuable insight into our current processes. And we suggest that the 4 tenets They are comprehensibility, applicability, actionability, and timeliness. We analyze that the information that we're sharing in that context to ensure that the space operators consuming this information ultimately can do something to better the community moving forward. My final thought is that cybersecurity is unique in this area in that the ambiguity around the analysis. If we look at the discussion just prior presented with an ASAT, very easy to observe specific characteristics of that type of attack. Not so easy in cybersecurity. So what we ultimately want to do is make sure that the information we're providing out there does reduce the ambiguity, and that reduced ambiguity will foster future trusted relationships across smaller communities of trust that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to jump into some questions. I'm going to, as we did the other day, take the prerogative of asking the first one. I would ask it anyway, the rest of the audience. Now, I'm getting on thin ice here. I'm not a space player, nor do I play one on TV. A little knowledge can be a dangerous thing, but I wanted to tie some of the themes together that we had here. So ASAT testing has been going on for decades, right? The US did this a long time ago. The Soviet Union was doing it too. There have been the recent ones where we had, I think the last time the US did it was 88 with the weather satellite. The bird frosting wasn't a test. That was a bit different. That was removal. We had the recent Russian one, we had the recent Indian one, and obviously the very famous Chinese one. At some point in international law, practice becomes accepted practice and becomes a norm. Just because people do it doesn't mean it's a good thing. So Nick and Pourvi and everybody, is ASAT testing a norm, or is it just bad behavior? Who wants to go first?
I would want to go first for this because not everything that's being done over and over is a norm, is what I would say. It is absolutely a bad behavior, no matter whatever the intention is, even if it is offensive or defensive. I mean, I stand for academia here, and I say no matter which country and no matter whatever is your intention, whether it is offensive or defensive, ASAT is a bad norm because it has tremendously and irresponsibly over and over added to the debris problem. And here we are today looking at the kind of outer space map that we have around debris. So irresponsible behaviors cannot become norms. There needs to be accountability, there need to be constraints, there need to be communication, there needs to be due regard for other space as well, given that we say space belongs to everyone. It's global common. So I would strongly say that ASAT cannot become a norm. In fact, there needs to be a norm to stop such kind of activities which are irresponsible and which are adding to the debris and these issues like such.
Okay. Do you want to chime in on that? Sure. Yes, Nick.
So the vernacular that has come into being over the last couple of years in the US anyway is norms of responsible behavior for outer space. And so based on that, I would say, no, it's not a norm of responsible behavior for outer space, full stop.
Would either of the other panelists like to add to that before we move to some of the online questions?
Yeah, this is Nick. I'll offer one thought, and just a programmatic note. The microphone is a little difficult for our online viewers to hear. One thing I do want to discuss is there's again a vernacular issue that we're seeing. How does responsibility align to sustainability? And I think we could look at the current proposed SSR characteristics. That is, what are the metrics by which we define sustainable behavior and describe that in the terms of responsibility, right? There's a minimum level of threshold that perpetuates this is a responsible behavior or this is not. Until we agree universally that over a certain threshold, be it debris generation or now I'm increasing undue burden on other parties to operate freely within space, that's where we're going to have this disconnect between responsibility and sustainability. So I think that's the topic at hand we need to discuss. I'll again use the opportunity to now tie in, where does cyber fall under that metric of SSR? How do we determine sustainability in the terms of cybersecurity in the terms of sustainability? And again, I think this translation that we're proposing allows us to take disjointed technical domains, i.e. very technical data on the cyber side, but actually tie that to potential mission impacts. This is one of the things that the Information Sharing and Analysis Center is looking to do, right? Not just share the information, but also show the potential mission impacts. What is the burden that we are presenting to the space domain? And that's, I think, the underlying foundation we need to analyze when we talk about responsible use of the space domain. Absolutely. How does that ultimately measure against other activities?
Thanks. I think Nick had a quick rejoinder to that.
Yeah, since we're on the topic of yeah, thanks.
Yep.
Since we're on the topic of kinetic ASAT tests, and I'm not sure it's going to come up again, I just want to make a couple of points. The Chinese ASAT test in 2007, I think about 10 or 12 countries called it out as bad behavior. The Russia November test last year was about the same number of countries who went on the record officially formally and said, this is bad behavior in aerospace. That's about 12, right? And then there was a couple dozen commercial companies. If you count the EU and NATO, who also called it out, then that gets a couple dozen more countries in there. But I'm really fixated on this, you need 60 countries. So we're back at 30 countries calling out the bad behavior of this ASAT test. It's still not enough to create a norm. So I just want to make that point that every country and every entity that has an interest in space sustainability needs to formally call out this bad behavior on the record, or we're never going to get to norms.
Thank you. I'm trying to hold the mic closer to the microphone. I see some comments about the audio, but I'd like to take an online question. We feel sorry for neglecting the online folks. They're invisible.
So this one is kind of in the vein of what the questions were just previous. How much is enough activity in space to serve our earthly needs?
Who wants to jump in on that one? Marius, are you still on?
Oh, look, David Finkelman has something.
Yeah, I'm here, but honestly, I'm not an expert on this, and I think this is extremely difficult to grasp, to be honest.
Okay, well, not every question is good. How about one from the audience here? We have. Oh, you want to go that one? Okay,
I just don't know. I don't want to. Since I'm sitting here, I don't want to dominate.
There you go.
But so as far as how much is enough, I would say who knows, right? Because look at how much is I remember when Pentium computers first came out in the early 90s, and it was like that's more computing power than anybody ever need. The 286, the 486, you guys remember those days. And so I think the potential for space making life on Earth better is just going to be more and more as long as we sustain it. Thanks.
You had a question?
It was a follow-up, and I was going to make it talk about ASAT more, so I'll defer.
You got another one on that? Okay.
Regardless of how bad the ASAT tests were, bad behavior, the nations that did it learned a lot of information about it. And so my question really is, as we move towards norms, guidelines, regulations, how the nations that did not take advantage of not being, socially or space socially responsible, how do we give them opportunities that the nations that did take advantage of these non-guidelines to get where we are today come to our level and equalize this situation?
I'm not quite sure I got that one. Does anybody in the audience or in the panel want to jump in on that one?
I'll reiterate it, is we gained a lot
from being space socially irresponsible, the US, Russia, China, and India. How do other nations that didn't take advantage of that irresponsibility now have to deal with the guidelines and all the costs of those guidelines and the norms that we want to put into place?
So a fairness kind of aspect.
Fairness,
Yeah. So I guess
They're starting from down below.
let's turn that around. So is bad behavior in the past of having to take care of past sins, let's just say, how does that deal with new actors in the space arena that have to confront this existing situation and being asked to potentially help solve the problem? I think is that a fair?
Close enough, yeah.
Yeah. So if we have some consensus on the question, I'm going to pick on you, Nick.
In international law, we generally say there is a concept of polluter pay principle. The one who polluted more should be the one who pays. Or we say there is another concept of common but differentiated responsibility. It is a shared space, and the responsibility should be depending on the kind of activity you carried out. So if you analyze those in the light of ASAT, and you say that, yes, they have made it difficult for other space actors who would now be, emerging in the domain of space. Let me quote an example. There was a small little country, Ecuador, which tried to send its first ever national satellite called Pegasus. They spent thousands of dollars spending on that one first satellite, but on the very first launch, it got defunct because of the debris there. And they had to put in a lot of money again to get that small satellite fixed. So that is where we are today because of the irresponsible behavior. Now, of course, there shouldn't be a competition on who is more irresponsible. And if you are more irresponsible, why not me? This cannot be a norm. There needs to be a way where you put a rein or a check on such kind of irresponsible behavior through the norm building. But the question here is how to build those norms first, how to bring the nations to a point where they agree on making a binding agreement, or how to persuade nations on the issue of negotiation. So that is the key task here. But as far as polluter pay principle goes, there have been debates where they say that we will have a orbital maintenance fund, or we'll have more space situational awareness to track who created more debris, and they would be made to pay, either in terms of maintaining that orbit or whatever way. So this is a pipeline, and that's why we say that there needs to be a nodal agency that will take care of sustainability of space, especially around debris.
Thank you.
So I need to take the opportunity to 100% agree on that. Dr. Pourvi, I totally agree with your comment that we need to make sure we understand what are the repercussions, right? First off, I think this is an incentivized versus penalized discussion. Ultimately, I'm a full proponent of incentivize first. We're far beyond that discussion, right? That ship has sailed. But I think it's important that we learn from this to say, this is not just, it's ASAT today, it's going to be 12 other things in the future. How do we put constructs in place today so we can incentivize, so we can not have to deal with these issues in a retroactive respect? The call out there right now is for a unified space function taxonomy. Right? That is something that from a cyber perspective, I now can more easily draw cyber data into space impacts. And I think what the call for here is, if I had that taxonomy, I can now say ASAT is irresponsible behavior due to the fact that ABC, right? Increases congestion, really reduces the problem space for maneuver. That is no different conceptually from spectrum consumption today. We have multiple constellations that are going up and polluting on the spectrum that we have the exact same challenge of traffic coordination today. That is something we can start to better incentivize. And I think that lays the groundwork to say, again, what is the level of parity you're achieving in the domain? Take resources, but put resources back, right? Use the space, but perpetuate it for sustained operations also. And we need to make sure that we incentivize parties to do that and not just have a retroactive penalized mentality moving forward.
You're just sitting here in front of me, so I have to pick on you.
Is that, well,
You don't have to
get back to your question. Well, so what comes to my mind is two things kind of intertwined, but the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the perception is India and Pakistan was in 1998 tested nukes before that treaty was going to come into force, the Test Ban Treaty or the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so yeah, so there was, I think, there was a slid down. There was a, they wanted to make sure they had the chance to test their nukes before this ban went in effect or the norm was created against underground testing of nukes. So there is kind of that precedent for countries to race to test something before the norm takes root, right? Right now, I don't see France or Japan or UK that are racing to try to test an ASAT, but irresponsible actors like Iran or Syria, like if they have the capability, they might still go for it. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but so then the point is just to, if the international community has made a convincing case against doing something, then hopefully that will have an influence on other countries' decisions, whether they were able to do a test or not before that became a consensus.
Where we go? Should we cut it there? Okay, I want to thank our panelists for their participation, even if we can't see you. So let's give a round of applause, everybody.